I came home from a 3-week trip to the sound of concrete trucks pouring a boat ramp into my private lake, one the HOA never had any legal right to touch. If you love watching entitled HOAs discover too late they built something on land that was never theirs, subscribe now. Deputies shut this whole project down that same afternoon. I came home from a 3-week business trip to the sound of concrete trucks. Not near my house, on my private lake. The one my family had owned outright for 60 years, the one that had never once belonged to any HOA. By the time I got the sheriff's department out there, the HOA had already poured $200,000 into a boat ramp on water they never had a single legal right to touch. If you love watching entitled HOAs discover too late that they built something on land that was never theirs, subscribe now, because deputies showed up that same afternoon and shut the entire project down cold. My grandfather bought that lake and the surrounding 18 acres back in the 60s, decades before any of the subdivisions nearby existed. It wasn't a community amenity. It wasn't shared water access. It was private property, deeded specifically to our family, passed down through 2 generations with the exact same boundary lines the whole time. When the HOA subdivision went up nearby almost 15 years ago, our lake sat directly adjacent to their property line, close enough that some of their marketing materials apparently showed it in the background of glossy brochures, close enough that a few residents occasionally asked about access over the years. I always said no, politely but firmly. It was private. It had always been private. That wasn't going to change, because a new subdivision happened to be built next door. I traveled frequently for work, sometimes gone for weeks at a stretch, trusting the property to sit quietly exactly as it always had while I was away. My house sat close enough to the lake that I could normally hear if anything unusual happened, but this particular trip kept me out of state for nearly a month, longer than my usual absences. I remember the exact moment I turned onto my property and heard it, the distinct, unmistakable rumble of heavy construction equipment, engines groaning under load, coming from somewhere near the water. My stomach dropped immediately, some instinctive part of me already understanding this couldn't be anything good. I drove closer, and what I found made me stop my car in the middle of my own driveway, staring in complete disbelief. A partially completed concrete boat ramp, extending directly into my lake. Construction equipment parked along what used to be a quiet, undeveloped shoreline. Workers in reflective vests moving equipment and materials like this was simply routine construction on land they had every right to be developing. I got out of my car, walking toward the nearest worker, my confusion rapidly transforming into genuine anger. "What exactly is happening here?" I asked, unable to fully keep the edge out of my voice. The worker, seemingly unbothered, gestured vaguely toward a nearby trailer. "You'll want to talk to the site supervisor. We're building the new community boat ramp for Lakeside Ridge Estates." Lakeside Ridge Estates, the HOA subdivision bordering my property. "This is my lake," I said, feeling my voice rising slightly despite my best effort to remain composed. "This entire property has belonged to my family for over 60 years. The worker's expression shifted slightly, uncertainty flickering across his face for the first time. "I don't know anything about that, sir. We were told this project was fully approved and permitted." I walked directly toward that trailer, my mind racing through every possible explanation for how something like this could happen, how an entire construction crew could show up and begin pouring concrete into private water without anyone from the HOA ever contacting me directly. Inside, I found a man in his 50s reviewing blueprints spread across a folding table, clearly the site supervisor the worker had mentioned. "I need you to explain to me," I said, stepping directly into his line of sight, "exactly why there's construction equipment sitting on my private property, building something in water my family has owned for 6 decades. He looked up, confusion crossing his face. "Sir, this project was authorized by the Lakeside Ridge Estates HOA board. We have full permits and approval documentation." "Approved by who, exactly?" I asked. because it certainly wasn't approved by me, and I'm the only person who's ever had legal authority over this lake. The supervisor's confidence noticeably faltered, glancing down at his blueprints again like he was searching for something that might explain the growing disconnect between what he'd been told and what I was now telling him directly. "Let me make a call," he said slowly, reaching for his phone with visibly less certainty than he'd carried just moments earlier. I stood there watching him dial, understanding with absolute clarity that whoever had authorized this project either genuinely believed they had legitimate rights to my lake or had deliberately proceeded knowing full well they didn't. Either way, I was about to find out exactly how a $250,000 construction project had ended up sitting on land it never should have touched in the first place. I stood there while the site supervisor made his call, watching his expression shift through several stages of confusion before finally settling into some, a thing that looked genuinely concerned. He hung up and turned back to me. "The HOA board president is on her way," he said. "She's saying there's documentation confirming proper authorization for this project." "I'd love to see that documentation," I said, "because I've owned this property my entire life, and I've never signed anything granting anyone permission to build on my lake." While we waited, I called my attorney, a methodical property law specialist named Harrison, who'd handled various boundary and inheritance matters for my family over the years, going back to when my grandfather originally established the deed structure that had kept this property firmly within our family. "I need you to pull the original deed and boundary survey immediately," I told him, walking him through what I'd found upon returning home. "There's an active construction crew building a boat ramp directly into my lake, and they're claiming HOA authorization." Harrison's response was immediate and firm. "Don't sign anything. Don't verbally agree to anything. And document everything you can with photos and video before this conversation with the HOA president happens. If they genuinely believe they have authorization, I want to understand exactly what they think that authorization is based on." I spent the next 20 minutes taking photos of the entire construction site, the partially completed ramp extending into water that legally belonged entirely to me, the equipment, the permits posted near the site entrance that I hadn't previously noticed. Those permits caught my attention immediately once I looked closely. County construction permits, properly filed and approved, listing the project location using an address that, upon closer inspection, appeared to reference a small strip of land technically adjacent to my property, rather than my actual lake itself. I photographed those permits carefully, sensing immediately that this discrepancy might become significant. A car pulled up moments later, a woman stepping out with the confident, brisk energy of someone accustomed to handling problems through sheer force of authority rather than genuine understanding of the situation. "I'm Deborah Ashcroft, HOA board president," she said, extending a hand I didn't take. "I understand there's some confusion about our community boat ramp project." "There's no confusion on my end," I said. "This is private property. My family has owned this lake for over 60 years. I never granted permission for any construction here." Deborah's confident expression flickered slightly, though she recovered quickly. "Our development team assured the board this location was properly cleared for construction based on survey work completed prior to project approval." "Whose survey work?" I asked. She hesitated. "I'd have to check with our project coordinator specifically." "I'd strongly recommend you do that," I said, "because I have the original deed and survey for this entire property, and none of it grants anyone outside my immediate family any rights to this lake whatsoever." Deborah's composure shifted again, something calculating entering her expression now. "Regardless of any discrepancy, we've already invested significant resources into this project. Perhaps there's a way we could discuss formalizing some kind of access agreement, given the circumstances." "The circumstances," I said, "are that your organization built a $250,000 structure on private property without ever contacting the actual owner. That's not something we negotiate our way around casually." I called Harrison back immediately after that conversation, relaying everything Deborah had said, particularly her admission that the project relied on survey work whose origin she couldn't immediately explain. "That's actually very useful," Harrison said. "If they're constructing, GIM permits reference incorrect location information, and their survey work can't be properly sourced. That suggests either significant negligence in their due diligence process or someone deliberately misrepresented property boundaries to get this project approved in the first place. What do we do now? I want the county involved immediately, Harrison said. Not to negotiate, but to formally verify boundary lines and potentially issue a stop work order based on unauthorized construction on private property. Given the scale of what's already been built, this needs official documentation before anything else happens here. I called the county's code enforcement office that same afternoon, explaining the situation while Harrison simultaneously drafted formal documentation establishing my family's clear legal ownership going back decades. Within 2 hours, county officials arrived alongside sheriff's deputies, walking the disputed boundary with professional surveying equipment while Deborah stood nearby, her earlier confidence noticeably diminished as she watched officials confirm, measurement by measurement, exactly what Harrison and I already knew to be true. The county surveyor worked methodically, comparing his precise measurements against both the current construction site and the boundary documentation Harrison had provided electronically just an hour earlier. I watched Deborah's expression grow increasingly tense with each measurement he called out, numbers that consistently confirmed the boat ramp sat entirely within my family's legally recorded property lines. Based on these measurements, the surveyor finally said, addressing both Deborah and the sheriff's deputy standing nearby, the entire construction site, including the completed portion of the ramp, sits approximately 40 feet inside privately owned property. There's no ambiguity here. This isn't a boundary dispute requiring further investigation. This is unauthorized construction on private land. The deputy turned to the site supervisor, who'd remained nearby throughout the entire process, watching his crew's equipment sit idle since our initial confrontation. I'm going to need you to halt all work immediately and have your crew clear the site until this situation is fully resolved. Deborah stepped forward, her earlier confidence largely replaced by visible frustration. This project represents a significant community investment. Surely there's some reasonable path forward that doesn't involve simply shutting everything down. Ma'am, the deputy said, his tone firm but not unkind, your organization built a structure on land you don't own, without any documented easement or agreement with the actual property owner. That's a legal matter between your association and Mr. Whitfield, but until it's properly resolved, this site remains closed. I felt something settle in my chest watching that exchange, a mixture of vindication and genuine curiosity about exactly how this entire situation had escalated to this point without anyone from the HOA ever simply reaching out to me directly beforehand. Harrison arrived in person about an hour later, having driven out immediately once he understood the scope of what county officials had already confirmed. He walked the site carefully alongside me, documenting everything with his own photographs and notes. I want to understand exactly how this happened, he said, because someone within their organization either made a catastrophic error or knew exactly what they were doing and proceeded anyway, betting you wouldn't notice or wouldn't push back seriously. We requested, through formal legal channels, complete documentation from the HOA regarding how this project had been approved, specifically the survey work Deborah had mentioned during our initial confrontation. What arrived 2 weeks later, after Harrison's persistent formal requests, revealed something considerably more troubling than simple negligence. The survey the HOA's development team had used to justify the project's location had been commissioned nearly 3 years earlier, conducted by a surveyor who, according to public licensing records, had his license suspended shortly afterward due to unrelated professional misconduct issues in a completely different county. More concerning still, that original survey had actually correctly identified my property's boundary lines. The construction plans submitted for county permits, however, showed a boundary line shifted significantly, conveniently placing the boat ramp's location just barely within what the falsified plans represented as HOA-controlled common area. Someone had deliberately altered survey documentation to make an unauthorized construction project appear legitimate on paper. This isn't just negligence anymore, Harrison said, reviewing the discrepancy between the original survey and the altered construction plans. Someone specifically falsified these documents to secure county permits for a project they knew, at some level, didn't actually have legitimate legal standing. I sat with that revelation, feeling the full weight of what it actually meant. This wasn't simply an HOA board making an honest mistake about property boundaries. Someone within Lakeside Ridge Estates had knowingly falsified official documentation specifically to build on land they understood. At least at some point in this process, they didn't actually have any legal right to touch. Harrison filed a formal complaint with the county, attaching both the original accurate survey and the falsified construction plans side by side, along with a detailed timeline establishing exactly when and how these documents had apparently been altered. The county's response was immediate and serious. What had started as a straightforward property boundary dispute was rapidly escalating into something involving potential document fraud, an investigation now extending well beyond simply determining who owned which specific feet of shoreline. The county's fraud investigation moved quickly once the falsified survey documentation became part of the official record. Investigators requested every piece of correspondence related to the boat ramp project, board meeting minutes discussing its approval, and detailed financial records showing exactly how the $250,000 construction budget had been allocated and spent. Harrison and I met with the lead investigator, a methodical woman named Carla, who walked us through what her team had uncovered after nearly 3 weeks of digging through HOA records and contractor communications. The falsified survey didn't originate from your neighborhood's development team directly, Carla explained. It traces back to Deborah Ashcroft personally. She commissioned a private survey update roughly 8 months ago, specifically requesting the boundary line be redrawn to accommodate the amenity project she'd been championing to residents. She knew, I said, the full scope of Deborah's involvement finally settling into place. Based on email correspondence we've recovered, Carla continued, she knew the original boundary correctly placed your lake as private property. She specifically requested the revised survey after facing pushback from residents who wanted the promised boat ramp amenity she'd campaigned heavily on delivering. The picture that emerged painted Deborah not as someone who'd made an innocent mistake, but as someone who'd made specific promises to residents during her campaign for board president, promises that required access to water her community simply didn't have, and who'd then deliberately falsified documentation rather than admit those promises couldn't legitimately be fulfilled. There's something else, Carla said, her tone shifting slightly. The original suspended surveyor we identified initially wasn't actually who created the falsified document. That was simply the name listed on paperwork to make it appear legitimate. The actual alteration was done using basic drafting software, likely by someone within the HOA's own administrative staff, working directly under Deborah's instruction. The formal charges that eventually followed reflected the full severity of what investigators had uncovered: fraud, falsification of official documents, and additional charges related to unauthorized construction and abuse of her position as HOA board president to facilitate the entire scheme. The community meeting that followed, once these findings became public, drew nearly every resident of Lakeside Ridge Estates, many of whom had genuinely celebrated Deborah's leadership specifically because she'd successfully delivered a lake access amenity. Other board presidents had apparently told them simply wasn't feasible. I attended that meeting myself, curious to see how residents would react once they understood the amenity they'd celebrated had been built entirely on falsified documentation and unauthorized use of private property. The reaction was immediate and intense. Residents who'd defended Deborah's leadership style for months, dismissing earlier concerns as simple growing pains during ambitious community improvement, now understood those improvements had come at the cost of deliberate fraud and theft of private property. She told us this was fully approved, one resident said during the meeting, disbelief evident in her voice. She specifically said the previous board's hesitation was just bureaucratic caution, that Shukiki he'd found a way to make it happen properly. Deborah was formally removed from her position that same night, the board's remaining members unanimously voting for immediate termination, given the scope of what investigators had confirmed. The county ultimately required Lakeside Ridge Estates to fully remove the unauthorized construction at the association's own expense, restoring my shoreline to its original condition. Deborah faced separate personal legal consequences for the document fraud specifically, including restitution requirements and a permanent injunction preventing her from ever holding an HOA leadership position again. As for me, I received full restitution for the temporary use and damage to my property, along with formal legal acknowledgement protecting my family's ownership going forward, specifically preventing any future development attempts without explicit direct authorization from me personally. 6 months later, standing on my shoreline watching the restoration work finally complete, removing the last remnants of concrete from water that had belonged exclusively to my family for over 60 years, I thought about how close this entire situation had come to becoming permanent simply because I happened to travel frequently for work. If I'd been gone even slightly longer, if that project had reached completion before my return, undoing something that established would have been immeasurably more complicated and expensive than catching it during active construction. Sometimes protecting what genuinely belongs to you requires nothing more than refusing to accept convenient explanations, insisting on proper documentation, and understanding that just because someone builds something quickly and confidently doesn't mean they ever had any legitimate right to build it at all. If this story hit you the way it hit me telling it, make sure you're subscribed, because the next HOA story I bring you, Migs, I'd expose something even more brazen than an entire construction crew building on land they never should have touched.